Welcome to the book show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Ayana Mathis is the best-selling author of The 12 Tribes of Hattie. Her new novel is The Unsettled. Set in the 1980s, the novel follows three generations of a family divided by a painful past. Ava lives in racially and politically turbulent Philadelphia, struggling to care for her son, Toussaint. Meanwhile, her mother, Dutchess, remains in her historically Black hometown of Bonaparte, Alabama, fighting to save her land. Their stories paint a portrait of a family on the edge and explore how history hangs over their best efforts to build better lives. Ayana Mathis's first novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, was a New York Times bestseller. She was born in Philadelphia and currently teaches writing in Hunter College's MFA program. Again, the new novel is The Unsettled, and it is a great pleasure to welcome Ayana Mathis to this week's book show. Thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I'm really glad to be here.
You were writing about this time in the mid 80s in Philadelphia. Did you grow up during that time?
I did indeed. So all of this is very certainly not personal experience directly, right? But certainly the sort of ethos and feel of the city at that time is very much part of my own experience.
So this is exactly when I grew up in Philadelphia. And as I was reading the novel, I realized how much that time and incidents that we will talk about throughout the course of this conversation are forever seared into your brain and sort of remind you and really taught lessons that I didn't even realize until I was reading this novel.
Isn't it amazing, like how much we are all sort of imprinted with these things kind of indelibly that you sort of don't realize are on you or in you. You know, it's the weird thing about writing a novel, or the funny thing, or the blessing, I don't know, is that these sort of imprints come to your aid when you're trying to recreate something, you know? It's astounding how much of it stays in you and on you and with you.
What was the initial thought you had that you wanted to explore?
I think there were a couple of things. And I should say that this novel took almost 10 years. So in some ways, when I'm asked about sort of its origins or its first, it's hard almost for me to trace because it's like a decade of like a million changes, you know? But what I can say for sure is that I knew that Dutchess, the character who lives in a southern town called Bonaparte, her voice is very strong, very clear. She came sort of early on. And I knew that she had a daughter. I didn't know what the contours of that relationship were. I didn't really know much about it. But I did know that there was a mother and a daughter who were estranged. I knew that the book had something to do with that. The other thing that I knew was that it had something to do with Philadelphia in the mid 80s period, with police violence, with groups that were sort of trying to live independently or separately, you know, sort of Black autonomy. And so I knew it was around those two things. I had no idea how they fit together. I didn't know anything about plot points. I didn't know any of that. But I did have a sense fairly early on that those things were definitely kind of major things that were at play.
Is it a fair question to ask you what it was that challenged you to have it take 10 years? The difficulty and coming to that mapping of what exactly was going to unfold?
Yeah, it's a very fair question, hard one to answer. I mean, I think, you know, in some ways it has to do with the first book, right? Like for a while, the response to Hattie was this sort of incredible blessing, but it sort of changed everything completely, right? Like I had this private relationship to writing, as everyone does. And then the miraculous reception to that book, everything was very loud. So for a while, there was just a matter of sort of trying to find some sort of privacy again, where I could kind of hear my own thoughts. And then with this book, I think, you know, it's a complicated book. It sort of resists easy classification, and it did to me too. You know, it was hard to figure out how the poles fit together. Bonaparte on one hand, Philadelphia on the other. Dutchess, as I said, was a character who came just sort of as a gift, really. She just sort of appeared in my mind, you know. But Ava, on the other hand, her daughter, was incredibly difficult. I couldn't hear her voice. I couldn't figure out how to sort of work her out onto the page. And as it became clearer to me that I was sort of dealing with some big thematics, like around, difficult motherhood, around fractured family, around belonging, around police violence, Black autonomy, the South, the North, these kind of big themes. One of the things, of course, that becomes, it's a book of fiction, so it can't be a pamphlet, right? Like, it can't be an essay. All of these themes have to be located in hearts and minds and spirits that play themselves out on the page. And so there was a great deal of trying to kind of be mindful of these larger things that I wanted to say, at the same time that I was being very mindful of basic things that are my responsibility. Story. Does anybody want to turn the page? Are these characters fully developed? All those sorts
Right.
of things. So that melding and that merging of my responsibilities as an artist with what I wanted to say in the sort of bigger realm of theme and such, that took a long, long time.
So Ava's character, this is an interesting character, a flawed character, a wonderful character, and I assume someone that you yourself have to come to terms with, that to write a full character, that you have to realize what the pluses and minuses are.
Absolutely. I think some of the reason that it took me so long to get her, if indeed I have gotten her, sometimes I wonder, I'm like, did I ever get her? I don't know.
Oh,
Because she's complicated. An editor of mine said to me, he described her as hard to love but impossible to hate. And that felt to me like a pretty apt description of her. I think I judged her for a long time. I struggled with how to make her kind of fully human on the page. And I'm never really particularly concerned with likability. I don't care. I don't need for people to like a character, but I do need for them to feel like a fully fleshed out human being. And so if I'm sort of reckoning with her in terms of judging her, or just sort of trying to understand the hidden parts of her character, then the challenge I run into is, of course, this sort of flat person. And because she's so difficult, the flat, I feel like often, if you're running into difficulty characterizing someone fully, but they have difficult aspects to their personality or psychology, what ends up happening is that those things come to the fore, and the rest of them is sort of shadowed by the difficulties. And then, of course, a reader can't attach to them, and they can't see them, and they can't. So there was a lot of work around trying to excavate her, and sort of hear her more clearly.
Ayana Mathis is our guest in this week's book show. The novel is The Unsettled. It is published by Knopf. When you talk about judging, do you worry that we judge the character, especially when it comes to Ava's role as a mother?
Sure. I mean, it's, one of the things I think that this book is interested in is, I make a joke to some friends and to my partner. I'm like, oh, I just keep writing about failed mothers. And I don't think they are not failed, but they are mothers who do not, by any stretch of the imagination, meet or align with the standards that we often have for mother, right? Like, these are not, do you want some cookies and milk after school? I'm always there. I'm always perfect. I always meet your every need. These are women, Ava for her son, Toussaint, Dutchess, Ava's mother, for Ava. They love their children very deeply, but they are also flawed, as you said. They're also complicated. Their own psychologies create these kinds of stumbling blocks in some ways for them to express their love in terms of giving their kids what they need. They're on the other end, the children, Ava, of course, Dutchess's child, Toussaint, Ava's child, have trouble sometimes recognizing the love that is being offered to them by their mothers as love. And the big thing is that their love, I think, in both cases, for both women, fails to protect these children from the forces that are massing against them. I think we have a lot of narratives about motherhood, and about motherhood as protective and as always sort of succeeding in that protection. And I guess this book is sort of saying in some ways, well, sometimes sometimes that love does not succeed in protecting the object, its object. And in fact, in this book, it often doesn't. So what I hope is that, though certainly Ava in particular is frustrating, I think she's very frustrating as a character, I hope that I'm also maybe raising some questions around what we mean by successful motherhood, by the
Right.
standards around motherhood, and also by the standards around motherhood that I think are class and raced. Do you know what I mean? Like, people with different sets of choices might mother differently because their choices are different. It seemed very important to me that that be sort of a part of the way that I approached these characters. What does it mean to mother in a situation where there are economic difficulties? What does it mean to mother in a situation where there are racial difficulties? For better and for worse, right? Like, their choices are both curtailed, but there's also a certain joy in the strangeness of their lives. But all of those things affect the way that they are able to choose to mother their children.
Both Ava and Dutchess meet men who they just become enamored
Mm-hmm.
with, to the detriment of their children often.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In certain ways, I think I wrote two books in one book, in a sense that their experiences are really mirrored, right? Like, Ava's and Dutchess's experiences are very, very mirrored in many ways. They both meet these charismatic, larger than life men that leads in different ways to destruction, to danger. They have very similar experiences. I think, in a certain way, the man that Ava meets, whose name is Cass, who begins this group called ARC, which is a kind of utopically aspirational Black separatist community. And he is, to my mind, and that community, he's sort of a dark mirror of the place that Ava comes from, where her mother still is, which is Bonaparte, and which was a very successful, for a long time, sort of utopic, independent, autonomous Black community at a time and place where that would have been nearly impossible, headed by this community, a man named Caro, who is charismatic and larger than life and the whole business. And I think, I think the difference, however, between Cass and Caro is that I think that Caro had a vision and a benevolence that perhaps Cass doesn't. So though both of these communities meet violence and ultimately a kind of demise, I think in Bonaparte, that experience and Caro was a kind of positive, powerful influence, whereas in the other one, in Philadelphia, Cass is not. Mother and daughter's experiences are mirrored, but a little bit different, I think.
So after a failed marriage, Ava reunites with Cass, and Cass,
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned, has started ARC, which is this commune-like setting for Blacks in the city, and in search of a communal living, a self-determined living. So this is what I was alluding to earlier on in our conversation about the links to what we both lived through, which was Move and
Sure.
John Africa, and that settlement in the city, which ultimately was left in tragedy and a bombing by police, which is what I said is still just inconceivable,
Mm-hmm.
now and then. But you seem to be very careful not to link it too much to that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't seem to want to make it that similar to what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it is most certainly, undeniably inspired by a lot of, or I should say, ARC and what happens there, and Cass to some extent, are most certainly inspired by what happened, by Move in Philadelphia, which happened on Mother's Day of 1985. And my book is set in the mid 80s. So certainly there's a conversation happening there, absolutely. But I didn't want to presume to tell that story exactly. For sort of selfish artistic reasons, I didn't want to do that, because I had a set of questions as I began writing into this novel that I was interested in, about the experience of living inside a community like that. And so I needed a sort of imaginative freedom to be able to imagine it. So if I felt as though if I had hewed too close to what actually happened with Move, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And then the second sort of equally important reason I didn't want to do that is because it's such a raw wound still, right? As you were just saying, it's such a raw wound in Philadelphia. And, one of the members of Move is still alive. One of the people that were in the house that the police bombed is still alive. She's the last one. And then Move still exists. So I didn't want to presume to sort of take that story and try to tell it exactly. It felt like it wasn't my place. And I felt like the better thing was a kind of homage through an exploration and a series of questions rather than some attempt to kind of retell it directly. And I wanted to, cast the leader, as we talked about, of ARC. He's a kind of an amalgam of a lot of things. He's a little bit John Africa, but he's also a little bit Black Panthers and a little bit Weather Underground and a little bit, these kind of like, he's a little bit of an amalgam of the Black liberation fighters of the 70s and also just these sort of like radical forces that sort of came into being in the 60s and 70s. And he's this kind of amalgam in my mind of all of these things, for better and for worse.
So to the worst part of how a community is to have any trust in the police when their community is bombed.
Yeah.
By a Black mayor.
Yeah, exactly. I think that these sort of twin poles of communities that are attempting to live autonomously. I mean, I think it's one of the novel's big questions. I don't answer because I don't know the answer, but it is sort of, how would it be possible? How is it possible for Black people to attempt to have some sort of autonomy, and even on basic levels, just bodily safety? How is it possible? Is it possible to make a community that might do that? How might it survive? What are its challenges externally and internally, right? So the challenges externally are things like police violence, as we've been talking about. There's all the economic challenges. If you make a community like that, or if you attempt to, like, how do you eat? Where do people sleep? How do you keep the lights on? And then other challenges internally. There are no heroes in this novel. It's an interesting thing, I think for people, they're like, the villains also have, there's always an and. Everyone is an and in this book. It's like, he's terrible, but also, or she's great. And also, so I was also interested in sort of the ways in which people's psychologies, ideologies, loyalties would also kind of be in the mix of things that present challenges to utopic communities and utopic Black communities in particular. So I think that there's a lot here that is asking questions about whether that's possible and kind of what it looks like, but without answers, I suppose,
Which struck me. I remember I was a high school student and I was on a field trip to go to, there were a few of us who were interested in being in radio, and we went to WHYY, and we were in the studio of Terry Gross when it was a local show. And at one point, Terry turned to us and said, who I want to talk to more than anyone right now is Wilson Goode. And because I have a lot of questions. And I thought about that as I was reading this novel over and over again, because I still have a lot of questions. And they're never really answered in your, obviously they're not really answered, and they're not answered in life, and they're not answered in the novel. And you almost wonder if they can be.
That's the thing, when I was finishing this book, sometimes you don't really know what a book is until you sort of get to the end. And even then you still don't really know what it is. And I remember thinking to myself, have I written a novel that is saying that it is impossible for Black people to be free or safe in the US? And I don't know, and then I was like, well, is that a question? That's a question I'm asking. And at whose hands does the unsafety come? You know what I mean? Which part of the answer to that question is obvious, but other parts are not, with the example of Wilson Goode, for example, right? And I don't know the answer to that question. And I don't even know the answer to my question that I posed myself. Like, do I think that it's possible for Black people to be safe or to be free inside the confines of this country? African Americans, I should say specifically. I realized this novel is asking that question, and I was like, I don't know how it answers it, and I don't know what I think about it. So I guess in a certain sense, I just think that I'm asking all of these questions that are in a certain sense unanswerable, as you said. I mean, Wilson Good, we could spend
Right.
2 hours talking about that. So I won't go down that road. But yeah, there's a lot of incredibly painful and utterly unanswerable questions there.
I want to push back gently on something you just said. To me, there was a hero, and that was Toussaint. I think of Toussaint
Yeah,
as
yeah,
a hero. This is a child who is a bridge, really, right? Of
absolutely.
looking at these generations, and it seems like looking at Ava and her mother, there has to be a future, and this child is the future, and seems
Yeah.
like that's not a bad place to start.
That's true. I mean, I think it's interesting. It's interesting that you said that. I suppose I've never thought of him as the hero of the novel, but I suppose in a certain way he is. And he most certainly is, very astutely put, a bridge in a future. I mean, Dutchess is the past. Ava is a very confused and fraught presence. And this poor kid, bless his heart, heavy as the head, as a one of the characters who he sort of befriends, this pastor who becomes a kind of confidant for him. And at some point she says to him, heavy is the head. But he is the future. He is the future. Yeah.
I do want to talk about Bonaparte, of that part of the novel, and especially Duchess, because this is a larger than life character that just screams from the page. And that first of all, I don't think anything about writing, of course, is easy or fun, but she seems fun
Yeah.
to write about.
Yeah. She was fun to write about. She was exciting. She was also, which is funny given how cantankerous her personality is, but she was also the most cooperative of these characters to write. Yeah, which is kind of ironic, given how spitfire she is. But yeah, she was a joy to write, actually, in as much as writing is no fun at all, but within that.
Right. But her actions are understandable, or can
Yeah.
be understood, can be explained.
Yeah, she's clearer. And it's interesting to me is that she is both the character that has a place that she understands very clearly as home, which is Bonaparte, which she has inherited. I mean, she wasn't born there, but she married this man. She goes there. She raises her kid there. He dies, and she stays as one of 4 or 5 other people who are trying to sort of hold on to this land. But she understands herself very clearly as custodian, caretaker, sort of the guardian of the legacy. And I think that there's no coincidence, when I sort of think about it, that her sure-footedness in terms of her role in the place where she is also contributes to her sort of clarity of vision about who she is, where she is, what she is, and how she came across on the page. She's very clear, in a way that Ava, I think, who has left this place and longs for this place being Bonaparte, but won't go back because she and her mother have a lot of beef. And also some very difficult things happen there for Ava. She is utterly sort of the opposite, right? Like, she's looking for something. She had a place that she came from that meant everything to her and shaped her. And then she spends all this time sort of wandering in the wilderness of the North in a certain way, looking to recreate this thing. And she is also a woman who is full of contradictions, full of certain sorts of confusions. There's a mirror there, I think, between how geographically and kind of culturally and historically sure someone is, or how unsure they are, and how their sort of personalities play out and how their psychology manifests itself, if that makes any sense.
It sure does. Well, and also with Duchess, it's very much a mom's reaction of, well, what happened here? How did this turn out to be our relationship with what I did? How did this turn out to be how she treats me?
It's really true. And she, Dutchess has the benefit of hindsight, even though the hindsight is painful, right? Ava's all grown up, she's
Right.
a woman in her 40s now. Ava's son is, when we meet him, he's 13, but in the bulk of the novel, he's 10 and 11-ish, So she's sort of right in the middle of making all these mistakes, with this young kid. She's sort of grasping, I think, in some ways to understand the trajectory of her life, but she's so very much in the middle of it that she's relatively unsuccessful in that effort. She doesn't have the benefit of 40 years or 30 years of hindsight. She's just right in the middle of everything.
The other thing about Dutchess, you make her a former nightclub performer,
Mm-hmm.
and it feels as though she's often performing. She's
Yes.
very much looking for that spotlight.
She's ever on a stage. She really is always on a stage. Yeah. That was one of the things that sort of came early about her as well, that she had been this itinerant performer, and she gives it up to go to Bonaparte and get married and live there. That was sort of part of her. I didn't have to look for that. That was just kind of part of the package of who she was when she appeared. There's a very kind of, I knew, as we discussed earlier on, I knew that there was this sort of move question was a big part of the book. But the instant you started thinking about that, then you start thinking about the 80s, and you start thinking about what happened in that decade. All of these characters in some ways are sort of reeling from the promise of a past that then has been completely co-opted, shut down, and utterly compromised by the time we get to the 80s. So that the setting in terms of time is no accident by any means. Bonaparte was this sort of thriving place, not sort of, it was a thriving, successful place. And then there are all these sort of challenges to it, from the fact that folks don't subsistence farm, the changes in agriculture, eminent domain, development, the Great Migration in some ways, all the children leave. So it's no accident by the time we get to the 80s, this is a place that is sort of fading out of time.
The name of the new novel is The Unsettled. This is such a beautiful masterpiece of a book, and I can't tell you how special it was to read it and to get to talk to you about it. I thank you so much for being with us.
I'm so grateful to you for reading and for your insight and for having me here today. Thank you so much.
Again, Ayana Mathis's new novel is Unsettled. It is published by Knopf. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.